and I wanted this morning to start a kind of a series, and it can be kind of lengthy, and I'm kind of hoping it will be a little lengthy. I want to do a series that I'm going to call Attributes of Leadership in the Characters of the Bible. Now, what this class is about leadership. It's about you men aspiring to positions of influence. Now, you should be that by virtue of the fact that you're a man. There should be a sphere of influence that you wield, whether it's among the youth, if you're a young person, if you have a family, you're a husband, you are a father, you have a sphere of influence, leadership there, and certainly in the church. That's what this is all about. Serious Men is about fostering leadership. The objective is not that you stay the same and hear a few good sermons, but that you're challenged at the deepest level of your life, that you fix whatever is hindering you from being a leader and wielding influence. And there are a lot of things that fall into that category. Today, men are very insecure. They don't want to be bothered. They just want to live their little lives and have their little circumstance and work their job and not aspire to anything beyond that. But that's not Christianity. That's not spiritual and Christian manhood. You should, by virtue of your conversion, your position in our church, the fact that you're attending a great church with great potential and that has an incredible need for men to rise to positions of leadership. So we're going to be talking about a broad, wide-ranging subject here. And so I want you to think about it. I might ask this question this morning when I'm done briefly with what I want to talk to you about. What characters in the Bible inspire you as a leader? What do you see in a particular character that says, you know what, I might be able to do something like that? Because one of the things that we're going to learn is that on a parallel track with great attributes of leadership in the Bible are flaws. Incredible human flaws, sometimes sin, sometimes weakness, sometimes inability. Men like Moses, for example, get in over their head. He's trying to counsel the entire congregation of Israel by himself. And he's wearing himself out, so you can get in over your head and not really know what to do, where to go, how to succeed. So there's a lot of subject matter. We're going to look at Moses. We're going to look at Peter. We're going to look at Elijah. We're going to look at Elisha. I'm going to look at Adam. I thought about him this morning. Leadership. There's a lot of failed leadership in the Bible. A lot of men that God counted on, that God invested in, that failed. And some of them recovered, some of them didn't. We're going to look at some of the kings of Israel. The kings of Judah. All the kings of Israel were bad. I don't know if we'll look at any of them. But we'll look at a few of the kings where they succeeded, where they failed. Some of the kings that had good attributes of leadership also didn't end too well. So there's a lot to cover here, and I want this to challenge you, and I want you to think about your own life and character, because what men do today is they hold on to who they are rather than let it go. It's the devil you know more than the devil you don't know sometimes. We don't want to tread into the unfamiliar. We don't want to be put in a position that that we're not totally confident in. You know, we have our little area of conduct. We feel confident there. We don't want to step outside the boundaries of that. And so, again, there's so much here, and I'm praying that this will challenge you. And maybe I'll get a couple of ideas today about a character that I haven't thought about. If you mention one, there's seats up here. We don't need more chairs. You come and fill the seats in the front. If you come late, you can't sit where you want to sit. All right, you can translate back there, but otherwise, send everyone forward. All right, Daniel chapter 6 is where I want to start from. If you're familiar with the book of Daniel already, you may be, and there are some very powerful dimensions here of leadership that we find in this very unique Bible character, Daniel. And the book really does focus on him, apart from God and the prophecies that are obviously located, the amazing prophecies that are obviously located in the book of Daniel. The book really is a focus on Daniel because he's obviously in the book from beginning to the very end of it. It covers several years. He survived 3 kings. I think it's 3, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. He's there present, serving God for all the ups and downs that were taking place spiritually and politically in Babylon at the time that he was a captive there. So let's just read these few verses. Daniel chapter 6. I remember many, many years ago, Pastor Warner preaching a sermon that this would have been when I was still a disciple, over 40 years ago. I remember this sermon that he preached from this text. And I want to just share a couple of thoughts with you, and we'll open it up for some questions. And hopefully by the time we're, my objective here is to rattle you, is to challenge you at the deepest level and let you know that the current contribution that you're making isn't good enough in some cases. It's not good enough. You're not utilizing the gifts, the abilities, the talent, the skill that God has given you. You're confining yourself to a much smaller sphere of influence that God would have you to dwell in. So I want to challenge you outside the boundaries of that. You're going to have to overcome some of your insecurities. You're going to have to deal with some of the flaws and the faults and the things in your life that may not take you to hell, but they're interfering with your leadership and your willingness to influence. So let's get started here. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps. So what did he do? To distinguish himself, to get attention on himself is what that means. Daniel distinguished himself above the governors because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. So the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom, but they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against this Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. And of course, chapter 6 is the chapter where Daniel ended up in the lion's den. So we'll get to a few comments about that in a moment. So I want to talk just about one feature. We'll talk about a few dynamics of it, but I want to talk to you about the call and the responsibility for you to distinguish yourself, even above your brethren and above others in the church. And again, in the text, then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and the satraps. This isn't something that he was trying to do. This isn't driven by ego. I want to be better. I want to be greater. It happened as a consequence of the quality of character that he had. He naturally rose to the surface. That's what this is about. He served. He's faithful. He's diligent. He loves God. He has a prayer life. He won't compromise. And as a consequence of that, he gets the attention of the king. And remember, he is surviving all the political intrigue that takes place in Babylon. By this time, Nebuchadnezzar, we don't know how that transition took place. We know how King Belshazzar died, but we don't know what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. But he passes from the scene, another king rises up, and Daniel still has his reputation with the political hierarchy in the land, and to the point where Darius wants to make him a prince in the land with great power and great authority. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit. It doesn't give us all the definitive qualities of that excellent spirit, but you can ask yourself that question: can I be described as someone who has an excellent spirit? And we can draw some specifics from the entirety of the book of Daniel, some of the things that he did and how he expressed himself. Certainly, but an excellent spirit would cover a broad range of virtues that I think we need to aspire to, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Now think about the disadvantaged position that Daniel is in. He's a Hebrew. He is in captivity. He has been taken by the Babylonians. We don't know his roots, his origins, how old he is. We don't know any of that. He's probably a teenager, maybe a young teenager, when we first meet him in Daniel chapter 1, when he distinguishes himself with Nebuchadnezzar. So he is a Hebrew, he's a Jew in a foreign land, a captive. He's hated by the king's court as he's just doing what he does, serving God, not trying to hurt anybody. And he has favor with Darius. He draws jealousy. He becomes a target of those who are Babylonians, because this Jew, this captive, this Hebrew, is rising above them in favor with the king. And there's the reproach that he suffers for worshiping the true and living God. He doesn't bow down to the false gods or the idols of Babylon. And in this particular chapter, he's plotted against. He has to survive this plot that comes against him, that anyone who prays to any other god needs to be executed. And Daniel, we know that he refused to kowtow to that. He went into his chamber, opened the windows, lifted up his voice, spoke in tongues, praised God, glorified the Lord like he always did. He's not going to allow a heathen culture to define how he prays. And that brought a death sentence. He's thrown into the lion's den. And this is just how Daniel lived his life. He's faced with challenges. He doesn't compromise. He rises above. We know nothing about his personality per se. He may have had some insecurities like we all do. He may have had some fears and uncertainties, but we don't read about those, because it's the virtue that is supreme in his life when he's challenged. And you know, Daniel's not the only Jew who is asked to bow down to the 75-foot tall idol that Nebuchadnezzar had built. I'm sure a lot of the Jews said, look, let's just go through the motions. Let's just do this. We won't really be worshiping the God, but we won't get ourselves in trouble. I'm sure there were a lot of Jews that thought like that, but Daniel said no. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego wouldn't bow down, and they told the king, if you kill us, that's okay. God could save us if he wills, but if not, that would be okay too. He'll just simply take us home. And so these are the dynamics of this courageous young man. And it took courage to live for God in his era. We don't have quite the extreme circumstances today, for sure, but we're still challenged on a lot of fronts. In the face of all of these disadvantages, Daniel distinguishes himself. Never bows down. Just being who and what he was defined him. Living his life out in faithfulness to God in this heathen culture is what distinguished him. The word to distinguish, Daniel distinguished himself. That word means to mark off as different, to set apart. See, some of you don't want to do that. You just want to blend in. To mark off as different, to set apart, to be distinctive, to make prominent, to be conspicuous rather, or eminent. And again, Daniel's not trying to do any of those things. He's just being who he is. But it's a consequence of this excellent spirit that causes him to stand out. It causes him to be an inspiring leader and to manifest attributes of leadership that are worth noting, identifying, and embracing for ourselves. So my question is, where are such leaders today? Leaders that will distinguish themselves by virtue of how they go about living their life in the context of their situation and their circumstances, serving God with an excellent spirit, not for personal gain, but for love of Jesus, and for the benefit of others, is what we're talking about. One of Pastor Warner's peers is a man that you wouldn't know, but he's been around as long as Pastor Warner has. His name is John Miola. He's pastored all over the world. I've known him for many years, but he got saved in the very early days of the Prescott Revival around the time that Pastor Warner did. And I preached for John on a number of occasions and seen him in various places where I've gone. And he told me one time that even as a disciple, Pastor Warner stood out. And you can see that, can't you? Because he still stands out today, doesn't he? The excellent spirit, he has distinguished himself, not because he has a massive ego that requires attention and a large, it's just how he lives his life. In the face of his automobile accident, not being able to walk, in the face of a bout of cancer in the 80s and chemotherapy, 20 years of infections that resulted in one of his legs being, he has one gear and it's full throttle. And this has distinguished him. And again, it's not because he's trying to get attention to himself. It's the enthusiasm and the zeal and the passion that he has for God. So that's my question here to pose to you. Where are the Christian men today that will distinguish themselves? See, the problem is that we don't want this in some cases. We have fears, we have insecurities. Our objective as men sometimes is just to build a comfortable life for ourselves. Have as few problems as possible, right? We want enough money to be comfortable, pay our bills, have a nice life, wife, kids, house, a few automobiles, be able to take a vacation every once in a while, and we think about life in those terms. But that's not acceptable. And if that is acceptable to you, then you don't belong in this class. Because this is about excellent leadership. This is about developing attributes of leadership. So let's just talk about a couple of those that we can identify from Daniel's life. In the first chapter, we find Daniel. Remember the first thing he did after he got the attention of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar sees something in these young men that so he wants to train them to serve him in the court. The training is going to take 3 years. They've got to learn the language, learn the customs, and they have to eat at the king's table. Apparently, eating at the king's table meant eating food that was unlawful for a Jew to eat, right? And so Daniel didn't, like for example, if you get invited to somebody's house and you're on Atkins, you're going to eat the chicken or the steak, but you're not going to eat the corn or the potatoes or the dessert, and you're just going to kind of fake it, right? You're going to pretend like you're eating everything, but you're not going to eat everything. And he could have done perhaps something like that, but he wouldn't even sit at the table. He said, no, I am not going to sit at the table. Vegetables and water is what we want to be served. So he had a spirit that even in the face, eating at the king's table is that was always a very most prominent, privileged place to be. At that time, Babylon was the most powerful, wealthy, rich nations on earth. If you read about ancient Babylon, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was an incredibly beautiful and wealthy city. They had conquered vast regions of territory all the way from the Middle East to the far extent of India, into Europe, into northern Africa, and of course the Babylonian Empire was followed by the Greek Empire, then the Roman Empire historically, but They were the first great worldwide empire and extremely wealthy, extremely powerful. And Daniel has been selected by an incredibly gifted man, Nebuchadnezzar, to sit at his table, and he refuses. So that's number one. He refused to compromise. How many times do you compromise in your life because you don't have the courage to make a stand for God? It could be at work, in the face of sin. It could be at school, listening to a professor babble about atheism or humanism, and you're afraid to raise your hand and make a stand and go on record that you're a servant of the living God and you don't believe what he says and this is what I believe, and so forth. So we compromise in all areas. Silence is a good way to compromise. I'm not doing anything, just keeping my mouth shut and preventing myself from getting into a lot of problems. And silence is probably the most common form of compromise. And we don't think of it as compromise. It just keeps us out of trouble, keeps us from bearing reproach. You make a stand at school, serve God. That's what we're looking for in high schools today. We're looking for young students that will distinguish themselves at school. That's how this revival in this church got started, with a few young men and women that got saved. Karen Martinez was one of them, that got saved in high school. They began to witness and tell others about Jesus. They distinguished themselves. They bore reproach, but they got the attention of other students that they were able to bring to church who got saved. So we're afraid of the reproach. Paul wrote to Timothy and said, yes, and all who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus will suffer persecution. All who desire to live godly in Christ Jesus. That's a pretty simple, basic premise that we all share. You're going to suffer persecution. That is, if you don't compromise. If you make a stand at work, at school, with your unsaved family, at the king's table, wherever it's required. So that's one, is that Daniel distinguished himself by not compromising. And we have to say, just from the chapter that we read, he distinguished himself by having a faithful prayer life. You know, man, we sometimes, and it's a constant frustration for all of us in leadership in pastoring a church of this size, that, you know, out of 500 plus people in our congregation, sometimes we can get 20 to 40 people out for morning prayer, which probably would be a good showing, but a lot of times not. Sometimes I come to prayer, there's 4 or 5 people when I get here. Sometimes there's silence. Pastor Mitchell shared with us. We put together a sermon on prayer that I'm going to be preaching when we fast this January, the end of December actually. And he was saying that sometimes he walks into prayer meeting and it's like a seance. Nobody's lifting up their voices. There's no tongues. There's no glorifying God. There's no exuberance. There's no passion. There's no zeal. I mean, in a congregation of this size, there should be men, people that are distinguishing themselves by being faithful to prayer meeting. I know Reno is here at 6 o'clock every single morning. I've had to come. Usually I come at 7, but there have been occasions, if I'm traveling that day, for example, I'll come early and maybe get some work done from 6 o'clock to 7, and the building's open. Reno's there, his truck, you can count on it. It's like clockwork, and he's faithful and diligent there every single weekday morning without fail, as is the attribute of Reno's life. He's a faithful man, diligent, always going about quietly doing his work, and by virtue of that, he distinguishes himself. He sets himself apart by his faithfulness, especially in the context of his prayer life. My standard for you is that if you can be in prayer, you need to be in prayer. I don't have time for lazy men. I don't. I will not disciple a lazy man. I can't disciple a lazy man. You prevent me from discipling you because discipleship and the attributes that we're trying to impart into your life are not conducive to you being lazy. If you can come to prayer and you don't because you're lazy, I don't have a lot of respect for you in that particular context. But again, prayer is one of the ways that you distinguish yourself. You show up to prayer in the morning if you can. You set an example by being early for church if you can to be in prayer. Sunday afternoon, there's probably not one reason why every one of you can't be in prayer. Sunday afternoon, you're not working, 5:30, you're going to set the example, you're going to get your family in order, bring them to prayer meeting because that's important to you. This is one of the ways that Daniel distinguished himself, and you can read through the rest of this chapter. We don't have time today in order to read the story of the lion's den. I mean, dying at the hands of a hungry lion is not a very fun way to die, but he's willing to put himself at risk in order to maintain his prayer life. While we pull the covers over our head in the morning, that's what Daniel's doing. And then thirdly, the third way that he distinguished himself, I'll just say longevity. He survived 3 kings, Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. He is called upon by all of those individuals. In Belshazzar's case, it was his wife. Remember, that said, no, there's a guy around here somewhere that's pretty good at interpreting things. Let's get him. And he's the one that interpreted the handwriting on the wall that was the death sentence for Belshazzar. So it's his longevity. He's consistent. He's faithful over the months and years. We don't know how long a period of time the book of Daniel takes place. I suppose that if I researched, I could get an estimate. But we know that in chapter 1, he's probably a young teenager. And then by the end of the book, he's obviously an older man. By the time the angel of the Lord visits him, he's a much older man. But he maintains a consistency and a faithfulness and a diligence throughout his life. He never lets God down. He's always there, always can be called upon to interpret a dream, handwriting on the wall. Now at the end of the book of Daniel, he's visited by the angel of the Lord, and he's still there. And the angel compliments Daniel as to his faithfulness and the fact that he had distinguished himself. And what does the Bible say? It says that the virtue in Daniel's life has gotten God's attention. So he never lost reputation within the kingdom of Babylon, at least with some. Obviously there were some that wanted to kill him, but at least with some he maintained reputation, and he maintained his reputation with God. So let me talk about 3 things that hinder. I'm just going to mention these and we'll open it up for questions. What hinders men from aspiring to leadership? Number 1, an unwillingness to discipline your life. This is the great frustration that I have. I see men that are gifted, they have ability, they have strength, they express that in different areas of their life, but they won't do it for God. Unwillingness to discipline your life in certain areas that require it for you to excel. There are probably a lot of world-class athletes. You know, sure there are. I'm sure there are athletes, or not athletes, but men who have athletic ability, but they'll never excel because they won't discipline themselves. Unwillingness to discipline your life. Number 2, unwillingness to deal with personal issues, problems, and character deficiencies. And by that I'm talking about your fears, your insecurities, things like that, personal issues that you have simply accepted as who you are, and you won't challenge those things. I have a lot of things I've had to overcome. A crushed personality by virtue of my upbringing, incredible insecurities and fears, shyness, not wanting to get up in front of people. When it was time for me to get baptized, I asked Pastor Warner if we could do it privately. I didn't want to get up in front of people. So you've got to overcome personal deficiencies that are hindering you from distinguishing yourself and having an excellent spirit. And then the third attribute is a refusal to think long-term. You know, thinking long-term and thinking about others is going to keep you from a lot of sin in your life, a lot of temptation, a lot of bad moves. I do what I do for the benefit of others. Look at what people are doing today for selfish purposes. They leave the church, they abandon the things of God, and their rationale is always rational, but it's personal. It's all about you and where you're at and what your situation is. Not a thought for God, His will, His people, what it's going to do in the context of diminishing your influence and so forth. People refuse to think long term. Sometimes to stay in place, it's going to cost you. You're going to have to just pay a price in order to be in the place that you need to be of benefit to God. And that's how we think. So the challenge for you today in this first lesson of the attributes of leadership in the characters of the Bible is to draw a line in the sand in your life and create a new beginning where you're going to say from this day forward, I'm going to distinguish myself. I'm going to embrace the attributes of an excellent spirit, and I'm going to make this the dawning of a new day in my Christian life. I want you to bow your heads with me today. This means that you have to make decisions to recalibrate your life and make adjustments. There's lots of reasons for Daniel and his companions not to rise up. Oh, I guess we have to sit at the king's table. Oh, I guess we have to bow down at this 75-foot tall golden idol of Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, I guess I can't pray the way I've always prayed. A lot of reasons not to rise up. But what we find in Daniel is courage, faithfulness, an absence of fear, and insecurity. And it's out of this atmosphere that he distinguishes himself. So I wonder if God could begin with this class something fresh, something new, something challenging. You've got to get out of your comfort zone. That's number one. Your comfort zone is a death sentence to the will of God for your life. And as I'm talking, I'm sure some of you men don't like this because you love your comfort zone. You just do. There's a lot of things you think you can't do. Therefore, you don't. It doesn't mean that those things you think you can't do aren't God's will for you to do, because God's dealt with you about some things that you said, well, I just don't feel comfortable. I just don't think that's my calling. But the problem is you're living in the confines of a prison cell of your own making. You know, when Jesus said, go into all of the world, these are fishermen. They're not world travelers. They're not preachers. They're not men of worldwide influence. But yet they went into all the world, preached the gospel, stepped out of their comfort zone, accepted the challenge. That's what God's looking for today. Father, I pray right now that you would touch every man's heart, bring conviction to every life, unto the experience of a spiritual revolution from the inside out. Challenge men in the framework of their discipline, of their prayer life, of their unwillingness to compromise, of their commitment to faithfulness over the long haul. I break the curse of insecurities and fears. I pray deep conviction unto repentance, Lord. And help us all to present ourselves as men in whom you can work, men that will distinguish themselves because you're able to impart an excellent spirit into our hearts. And we thank you, Lord, in Jesus' name. Amen. I want you to praise God right questions then. Someone can start us off with something relative to what I talked about, general subjects relating to leadership, critical arena, reason why we're here. If you're not interested in that, find something else to do. Amen. Somebody start us off there with a question or something that intrigues you, inspires you, challenges you in your life. Amen. Somebody start us off, brother.
Pastor, I want to step out of my comfort zone, break out of my cell in a way, as you said. And I want to learn how to, like you said, be a leader. And I really hope to be a pastor as I get married and all that in the future.
Yeah.
So I just want the best advice on how I could do that. And I know you said not to be lazy. And I try to put my own not being lazy.
Yeah.
I try to come to every service
Yeah.
I can. I'm a disciple.
Okay, how would you distinguish yourself at work? You have a job, I'm assuming.
Yes.
You distinguish yourself at work by showing up early,
Yes.
staying late, working hard. If you'll just do that, there's so few people that do that today, you'll be president of the company within 6 months. Right? Any of you bosses here, you get somebody that shows up early, they're getting their equipment ready, they're getting ready to go on the job. Distinguish yourself. In the context of the church, what we do around here, like you said, be in every service, come to prayer meeting, be an example and a testimony for others, encourage people around you, live a life that is an example worthy of following. Right? That is distinguishing yourself, and then it's just the day-to-day obedience. Tell somebody about Jesus tomorrow. Right? And so you do what you know to do. Don't worry about what you don't know. God will do a lot of things in your life that you have no idea at this point. You do what you know to do. There's two features to God's will for every life. One is the known, and then there's the unknown. The known is be in church, come to prayer, love your wife if you're married. You know, all the little things that we know to do that are part of God's will. Don't worry about what you don't know about future calling, what city or country you're going to be in, and what's going to happen in 10 years. Don't worry about that. Just do what you know to do. And as you do what you know to do, the rest will become clear as you move forward in life. All right, very good question. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Question about leadership. How is God challenging you today?
Pastor, I think from what I've seen, a lot of guys are afraid to step into that. Just the fact of coming and then being risen up, they're not used to it, and so they're like, how am I going to fit into this? And they kind of have this little insecurity to step into that.
Yeah, you just have to battle those within yourself over time. And be willing to. A lot of men cower to their insecurities and cower to their fears, and that creates a prison cell for you. Insecure people need to feel comfortable and confident. And that comfort and confidence for an insecure person is a very small arena. It's a very small space. And you'll never rise and do anything significant in your life as long as insecurities rule the day. You just have to muscle your way out from underneath them. You've done that. I've had to do that. We all have those types of fears. Some of it's rooted in our upbringing. Sometimes an absence of a good, strong father who sets an example and can impart confidence into your life will breed that. A lot of insecure men today, raised by women, great mothers, they're good, but they can't impart that manhood, masculine, testosterone-driven confidence. And so that can be developed, however, in the church by virtue of conversion as you accept various challenges that force you out of your comfort zone. Amen. Yes, brother.
What are some practices that you know of to get rid of any fear or anxiety or insecurity?
Insanity, I'm not sure, but fears,
No, anxiety.
fears and insecurity. Did you say insanity?
No, anxiety.
Anxiety, okay. Let's help you with your insanity. Those are things that melt away over time as you serve church, answer altar calls. Pastor Warner's always said that if you come to every service, 95% of your problems will be addressed. And you'll find a lot of growth takes place at the altar. I do not get, nor do I grasp or understand or comprehend people that don't answer altar calls. I don't get it. I don't know what's happened to them. My first impulse when I come to church, I don't even know what the pastor's going to preach on. We're going to a conference in a few weeks. Is I'm going to answer the altar call, and God's going to give me a reason for that during this service before I even know what's going to be preached. So the altar is where a lot of growth, a lot of decisions, a lot of challenges are made. And from the altar, you've obviously got to get up and then implement what God has dealt with you about. So I would say that my fears were addressed in church at the altar, but then you've got to face your fears, right? My son's afraid of heights, for example, but he jumped out of a parachute with his two sons in the run-up to his two sons getting married about a month or so ago. I don't have a video of that. He was careful to take a video of Jordan and Josh, but I don't have a video of Joe. He can't even climb up a ladder. But he got in a plane, scared to death, and jumped out. So you got to face your fears sometimes. You know, the first time you preach in the street, first time you witness to somebody, so forth. You just have to face them and not let them imprison you. Amen. Very good. Somebody else, Rick?
Yeah, Pastor, can you address the misconception of being a born leader as opposed to being, you know, that's something that's inherent in a person rather than being taught leadership? Or
Well, I think that plays out in a few different ways. Upbringing is critical. If you have a good, strong, healthy father, right, and you grow up with a confidence, that's a powerful head start in leadership, isn't it? If you've been raised underneath divorce, abandonment, that's going to breed fear and insecurity, right? So while I don't believe anybody is a born leader, I think there can be advantages that contribute virtue and character in a young person's life, a child's life, that can express itself. And those are the people who know that they're a born leader. But most of us are not that. We learned. God had to chisel away 90% of who we were in order to find the leader within. So leadership is learned and developed in spite of all the disadvantages that we bring to the table sometimes. And Pastor Warner was a heroin addict. He was in the hospital when he was first witnessed me because he got hepatitis from a dirty needle. I mean, we can't even fathom Pastor Warner like that. That's, you know, so leaders are made. And so disciples, pastors, it's all a construction project by God for the point of our conversion. Sometimes, like I said, you know, I got a very strong work ethic from my dad. So that is still working in me today. So, you know, there can be advantages, but anything that is required in leadership can be learned, even if it's not there. Very good question. Yeah.
You know, a lot of these guys, they're probably not asking any of those questions, but I remember bringing up Boys by James Dobson, and you know, you're in the right place because you're not going to find this. I know I didn't find it when I was in the world, but he encourages you to be in a place where you could be inspired by, you know, coaches, pastors, and other men that are, you know, that'll help you in that area where you don't have confidence.
Yeah.
So I mean, you're in the right place. You know, you're in the right place to let, you know, a man mold your heart and impart vision.
Yeah, and you guys do that just by virtue of being in church. A lot of you have distinguished yourself as good husbands and fathers and businessmen and good with money, honest, integrity, relationships, and so forth. So, you know, many of you, I know I've been a little hard on you, but I'm trying to challenge you, but many of you are distinguishing yourself and have distinguished yourself in very difficult and challenging situations and circumstances. So, yeah, that's it. Get in a place so you can take the most fearful, insecure man, deposit him in the church, and by the time God's dealt with him, he can be a world leader. Right? That's what you mean, just by being around men. Yes?
I remember when I first got saved, Manny came up to me, and I was very new. But he asked me, hey, you want to go to Paso? I didn't know what that was. face people and witness them. But I went with him every Monday, and I would stay behind him and I would watch how he would do it. And Manny has that boldness and courage, and well, I got it from him, you know what I mean? So now we go to follow up, and it's amazing what it does.
Yeah, it's called the buddy system.
Right.
No, it is. It's the military. I think it was during the Korean War. I may have this wrong, but I think it was during the Korean War, which followed soon after World War II. They didn't have the time to fully develop and train, and so they incorporated the buddy system where they would take an inexperienced soldier, put him with an experienced one, and then go out in the field together. And so that's how they would train and teach, and that's how they would learn. So that's a good example. Very, very good.
Pastor, what about like, well, you heard the term crabology, you know, like when somebody tries to excel, you know. I feel like as a youth, when I was, you know, growing up, like, even when I was praying and speaking tongues, I mean, do you have that insecurity that, you know, people are looking or people are gonna, you know, talk bad about you, or like, what would you say to like a young person who wants to be different, you know, but doesn't want to like excel because he feels that the peers are gonna like put him down and push him down?
You can't worry about that. That's what's going on in our text, isn't it?
Yeah.
Daniel's rising up. It's crabology, and the other disciples are trying to pull him down. So that's probably that's not a unanimous expression, but there will be some who are made to look bad by virtue of how you're going to prayer, you're serving God, you're available to the pastor. They'll call you, you know, the pastor's favorite. They'll call you kissing up and all those kind of accusations and so forth. But that's just because you're making others who aren't rising up look bad. And that's always going to be happening around a leader. Your life is going to bring conviction, and sometimes conviction doesn't bring repentance, it brings criticism. Right? So you just have to weather that storm. Amen. Anybody else? Very, very good. Thank you for those comments. George.
You know, Pastor, as we were talking earlier in another class, you know, when I first came to this church, a lot of people don't know it, but even I was contemplating suicide because, you know, I was, you know, 19, 20-year-old, and I could see that life, to me, had no meaning. It wasn't worth it. And, you know, when I was actually, the only reason I didn't really pull it through was because my dad had divorced my mother when I was 16. And I could see there was a mess at my house, and you know, I didn't find any reason for, you know, for life. But when I started coming, I gave, you know, God, I don't know, saw mercy. He brought me to this church, and to me, in my heart, I said, if there's anything that's got to be real, it's got to be this. And I did exactly what you did. You know, I kept coming, and there was a lot of insecurities, you know, divorced parents, and I mean, to me, I was just this little Mexican trying to fit in this world. And exactly that, I just kept coming to church because, again, Freddie Lozano would say that God had something for my life. And that gave me hope, you know, and one thing led to another, and here I am 30-something years later, and, you know, it is true. You just keep coming, you take God serious, you trust in Him, and He takes, you know, many of your insecurities and starts giving you meaning in life.
Amen. Very good. Okay, let's finish on that note. Let's all stand. We'll shift gears and examine another character next week and continue this through. So you come and prepare to open your heart. And I'm praying that out of each one of these individuals, you'll be able to draw something that you can embrace as your own, from Daniel's life, from Moses, from Peter, from all the different characters that distinguished themselves in the Bible. So let's praise God, let's thank Him, and then Angel Montalongos will close us in prayer. Father, we thank you so very much for the grace of God here today.